The fastest thing in the sky. March 14th, 1945. Captain Don Bryan was heading home in his P-51 Mustang after escorting bombers deep into Germany. The war was nearly over. Everyone knew it. The Third Reich was collapsing, squeezed between the Soviets advancing from the east and the Western Allies pushing in from France. Below him, American engineers were desperately trying to keep the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact, the last bridge standing across the Rhine, a crucial gateway into the heart of Germany. Then, Bryan saw it, a shape he'd encountered 3 times before, but never managed to catch. It was making a bombing run on the bridge, moving so fast it seemed to bend the rules of physics. The aircraft had no propellers. Instead, 2 jet engines hung beneath sleek wings, emitting a piercing roar completely unlike the growl of piston engines. This was an Arado Ar 234 Blitz, the world's first operational jet bomber. And it was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than anything Bryan was flying. "I'm not letting one get away from me again." Bryan thought out loud. He'd tried 3 times before. Each time the German jet had simply accelerated away, leaving him behind like he was standing still. But this time was different. After dropping its bomb, the R-234 pilot made a tight turn, slowing down just enough. Bryan seized the moment. His machine guns tore into one of the jet engines. With only one engine functioning, the German bomber couldn't outrun him anymore. Bryan closed in and shot it down, the first air-to-air kill of an Arado R-234. It took a mistake for an Allied fighter to finally catch one. When flown properly, the R-234 was untouchable. It could reach 461 miles per hour at 20,000 feet faster than any Allied fighter likely to intercept it. When the first ones appeared over Europe in late 1944, most Allied airmen didn't even know what they were looking at. Many had never heard of jet engines, let alone a jet bomber. Those who glimpsed these aircraft saw them as flashes in the sky, there one moment, gone the next. The few pilots who tried to pursue them described the same frustrating experience, closing in. Thinking they had a shot, then watching the German jet simply accelerate away, as if mocking them. The R-234 represented a quantum leap in aviation technology. It was the kind of weapon that could change the course of a war. Except by the time it appeared, Germany was already losing. And the reasons why tell us everything about how the Nazi regime squandered its most advanced technologies through confusion, competing priorities, and catastrophic decision-making at the highest levels. A weapon born too late. The story begins back in 1940, when the German Air Ministry issued a tender for a jet-powered high-speed reconnaissance aircraft with a range of over 1,300 miles. Only one company responded, Arado Flugzeugwerke, led by Professor Walter Blum. Their proposal was revolutionary, a high-wing aircraft powered by 2 Junkers UMO-004 turbojet engines. Arado estimated it would reach 480 miles per hour at 20,000 feet and operate at altitudes up to 36,000 feet. The Air Ministry liked what they saw and promptly ordered 2 prototypes designated R-234. But there was a problem. The Junkers UMO-04 turbojet engine didn't exist yet as a production item. It was still being developed, and development wasn't going well. Throughout 1941 and 1942, Arado built the airframes for their prototypes, but they sat in hangars waiting for engines. Meanwhile, Messerschmitt was developing their own jet fighter, the Me-262, and they had priority for engine deliveries. Arado had to accept whatever they could get. It wasn't until July 1943, 3 years after the initial order, that the first AR-234 prototype finally took flight. Test pilot Flugkapitän Selle lifted off from Rhine Airfield on July 30th using an unusual system. The aircraft was so streamlined with its fuselage packed full of fuel tanks that there was no room for conventional landing gear. Instead, the R234V1 took off on a jettisonable wheeled trolley and landed on retractable skids mounted under the fuselage. It was an elegant engineering solution to a space problem, but landing on wet grass felt like landing on soap. According to test pilots, the skids had no braking capability whatsoever. By September, 4 prototypes were flying. Adolf Hitler himself came to see the third prototype demonstrated at Insterburg. He was enthusiastic and immediately authorized Arado to obtain the factory personnel, raw materials, and funding necessary to build 200 aircraft by the end of 1944. But Hitler saw the AR-234 primarily as a reconnaissance aircraft. He was obsessed with Britain's de Havilland Mosquito, a wooden reconnaissance plane that zoomed over Germany with near impunity. He boasted to his staff that the R-234 was even faster than the Mosquito. What he didn't emphasize was using it as a bomber. The Air Ministry, however, had other ideas. Back in July 1943, even before the first flight, they'd been seriously considering a bomber version. In March 1944, the first bomber prototype, designated R234B, took its maiden flight. This version featured conventional tricycle landing gear that retracted into a widened fuselage. It could carry up to 1,500 kilograms of bombs externally on racks beneath the fuselage and engine nacelles. The pilot sat alone in a pressurized cockpit with excellent visibility forward, but none to the rear, relying on a periscope to aim defensive guns that most pilots found useless and eventually removed. On August 2, 1944, an R234 made history. Lieutenant Erich Sommer flew the V-7 prototype over the Normandy beachheads at 460 miles per hour, using cameras to capture images of Allied supply depots and troop movements. It was the first jet aircraft ever to fly a reconnaissance mission. The plane returned to base completely untouched. No Allied fighter had come close to intercepting it. The bomber that wasn't. This should have been Germany's moment. The Allies were flooding into France. German cities were being systematically destroyed by round-the-clock bombing. The Luftwaffe was being bled white, losing pilots faster than they could train replacements. Germany desperately needed every advantage it could get. And here was a bomber that Allied defenses simply couldn't stop. But production was painfully slow. Arado had been tasked with maintaining production to compensate for other factories destroyed during the USAAF's Big Week bombing campaign in February 1944. They were also engaged in license construction of the problematic Heinkel He-177 heavy bomber. Resources were stretched impossibly thin. Between mid-1944 and the end of the war, only 210 AR-234B aircraft were completed, far fewer than the thousands that would have been needed to make a strategic impact. More importantly, Hitler's interference with jet aircraft development had created chaos across the entire program. The story of the Me-262 fighter is instructive here. When Hitler saw the Me-262 in 1943, he asked if it could carry bombs. When told it could, he became fixated on the idea of using it as a Blitz bomber, a fast bomber that could zip along invasion beaches and drop bombs into massed Allied troops. At a conference on May 23, 1944, Hitler discovered that despite his previous orders, the Me-262 was still being manufactured exclusively as a fighter. He exploded in fury. Hermann Göring communicated Hitler's orders to a meeting of officials. The Me-262 would be rearmed and readjusted as a bomber. No one was to refer to it as a fighter or even a fighter-bomber, only as the Blitz bomber. Willy Messerschmitt and others tried desperately to argue against this decision, but Hitler wouldn't hear it. He rejected arguments that the aircraft would be more effective as a fighter against the Allied bombers destroying German cities. He wanted it as a bomber for revenge attacks. The modifications required time. Bomb racks had to be installed. Fighter production was diverted to bomber production. Pilot training shifted from fighter tactics to bombing runs. All of this happened while Germany's cities burned and the Luftwaffe fighters were overwhelmed by Allied numbers. The historical debate about whether Hitler's interference significantly delayed the Me-262 program continues, with some historians arguing that engine reliability problems were the main issue. But one thing is undeniable: the confusion and constantly shifting priorities prevented Germany from concentrating its limited resources effectively. When you're losing a war, you can't afford to waste time on organizational chaos and contradictory orders. The AR-234 suffered from similar problems. While it was always intended to have both reconnaissance and bomber variants, the emphasis kept shifting. Production prioritized reconnaissance versions first, then bomber versions, then back again. Training programs started and stopped, units formed and disbanded. By the time the AR-234 was actually deployed in meaningful numbers, Germany was already collapsing. Too little, too late. The AR-234 bomber version finally saw combat with Kampfgeschwader 76 in January 1945. The unit flew from airbases at Rheine and Akmer in Lower Saxony. Their mission was to provide close air support during the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate last offensive in the Ardennes. The AR-234 bombers made many daring and accurate strikes. Pilots loved flying them. They described the aircraft as fast and aerobatic, a joy to fly compared to the lumbering conventional bombers they'd trained on. But it was like bringing a sports car to a demolition derby. By January 1945, Germany had already lost the war. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel. Trained pilots were scarce. Allied air superiority was absolute. You couldn't fly anywhere over Germany without encountering swarms of Allied fighters. The jet engines themselves were a constant problem. The Junkers UMO 004B had a service life of only about 25 hours. After that, they needed replacement, but replacement engines weren't available. Many AR-234s were destroyed or captured on the ground simply because they had no serviceable engines. The most famous use of the AR-234 came during repeated attempts to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen between March 7th and 17th, 1945. After American troops captured the bridge, the last traditional bridge standing across the Rhine, Reichsmarschall Göring ordered it destroyed at all costs. For 10 days, AR-234 bombers flew sortie after sortie trying to take it down. They failed. Some were shot down despite their speed. Others missed their targets. On March 17th, the bridge finally collapsed on its own due to structural damage, but by then the Americans had built pontoon bridges and established a solid foothold on the east bank. The jets had accomplished nothing. The final sorties of AR-234s were flown against the Red Army near Berlin in late April and early May 1945. On April 14th, an AR-234 conducted a reconnaissance flight over England, the last Luftwaffe aircraft to fly over Britain during the war. Days later, Germany surrendered. In total, only 210 AR-234Bs and 14 of the improved four-engine AR-234C variants were delivered to the Luftwaffe. Of those, only a handful ever got into combat. A final inventory on April 10, 1945, listed just 38 in service, 12 bombers, 24 reconnaissance machines, and 2 night fighters. Germany in ruins. While the AR-234 arrived too late to make any difference, the Allied bombing campaign it might have countered was utterly devastating. By 1944, British and American bombers were dropping an average of 3,000 tons of bombs per day on Germany. The campaign had evolved from limited precision strikes in 1940 to massive area bombardment designed to destroy Germany's industrial capacity and break civilian morale. The methods were brutally effective. High explosive bombs would first tear off roofs and expose the wooden frames of buildings. Then waves of incendiary bombs would set everything ablaze. Finally, more explosives would hamper firefighting efforts. The results were catastrophic. In July 1943, Operation Gomorrah created a firestorm in Hamburg that killed more than 30,000 civilians and made hundreds of thousands homeless. In Berlin, bombing raids from November 1943 to March 1944 left 400,000 people without homes. A single raid on Wuppertal made 100,000 residents homeless overnight. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 became the most controversial Allied action of the war. From February 13th to 15th, over 1,200 Allied bombers of the RAF and U.S. Army Air Forces launched 4 attacks on the city. They dropped approximately 2,700 tons of explosives and incendiaries. The city, filled with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance, was virtually destroyed. The firestorm was so intense that people's shoes melted into the hot asphalt. Those running from the flames could feel the heat burning their lungs through their backs. Trees exploded from the heat of their own resin. 70% of the victims actually suffocated from carbon monoxide. Estimates of deaths range from 25,000 to more than 60,000, though the exact number will never be known. Dresden had largely escaped bombing until late in the war because it was considered a cultural treasure, the Florence on the Elbe. But in early 1945, with the Red Army just 70 kilometers from Berlin, Allied commanders decided the city's rail yards and factories made it a legitimate military target. After the war, critics argued the bombing was unnecessary and disproportionate. Defenders pointed out that Dresden was an important rail center for moving German troops to resist the Soviet advance, and that it housed 127 factories producing war materiel. The debate continues to this day, but the broader point was undeniable. By early 1945, Germany had been bombed into submission, fuel production had collapsed, transportation networks were shattered, factories lay in ruins. Even if Germany had possessed miracle weapons like the R-234 in sufficient numbers, there was no fuel to fly them, no spare parts to maintain them, and no intact infrastructure to support their operations. The survivors. After Germany surrendered, Allied intelligence teams scrambled to capture as much German technology as possible before the Soviets could seize it. The R-234 was high on their priority list. Under Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe, secret technology teams commanded by Colonel Harold E. Watson found 4 AR-234s that had been handed over at Sola Airfield near Stavanger, Norway. The aircraft were transported to the United States and Britain for rigorous examination. American and British engineers were astonished by what they found. The R-234 was technologically sophisticated in ways that would influence jet bomber design for decades. Its clean aerodynamic lines, engine placement, and systems integration were remarkably advanced. The cockpit layout, the pressurization system, the autopilot for bombing runs the innovative landing gear. All of it represented cutting-edge engineering. Today, only one AR-234 survives. It's displayed at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia. The aircraft is an R-234B2 bomber variant, serial number 140312. It sits there as a testament to what might have been a technological marvel that arrived too late in too few numbers to change anything. Walking around it, you can see the elegance of its design. The way the jet engines hang cleanly beneath the wings, the streamlined fuselage, the greenhouse canopy that gave the pilot such excellent visibility. It's easy to imagine how terrifying this aircraft must have been to Allied crews in early 1945, a shape materializing out of nowhere too fast to track, dropping its bombs and vanishing before anyone could react. The lesson of the lightning. The story of the Arado R-234 Blitz isn't just about a failed wonder weapon. It's about how wars are won and lost by more than technology alone. Germany had some of the most advanced weapons in the world by 1944 and 1945. They had jet fighters and jet bombers. They had guided missiles and ballistic rockets. They had infrared night vision equipment and advanced radar. None of it mattered because they didn't have the fuel, the trained personnel, the industrial capacity, or the time to deploy these weapons in meaningful numbers. More fundamentally, they didn't have the strategic clarity to use what they had effectively. Hitler's obsession with bombers, his desire for revenge weapons that could strike back at Britain rather than defensive fighters that might protect German cities, wasted precious time and resources. The constant reorganizations, the conflicting priorities, the interference from the top, the bureaucratic chaos of a dictatorship where everyone feared making the wrong decision, all of it combined to ensure that Germany's technological advantages never translated into operational success. If the R-234 had been available in 1943 instead of 1945, if Germany had produced thousands instead of hundreds, if they'd had the fuel and pilots and infrastructure to support operations, then maybe it could have made a difference. Fast bombers that couldn't be intercepted might have disrupted Allied supply lines in France. They might have struck at Soviet advances with impunity. They might have bought Germany more time. But that's the thing about might have been. By the time the R-234 appeared, Germany had already lost. Not because they lacked advanced technology, but because they'd squandered 4 years making terrible strategic decisions, antagonizing the entire world, committing unspeakable atrocities, and exhausting their resources in an unwinnable war. No jet bomber, no matter how fast or advanced, could compensate for fundamental strategic bankruptcy. The Arado R-234 Blitz was the fastest thing in the sky. It was a glimpse of the future of aviation, a technological achievement that influenced jet bomber design for generations. But in the context of World War II, it was nothing more than lightning that struck too late to illuminate anything but ruins. As Germany's cities burned and the Third Reich collapsed, this revolutionary aircraft sat on airfields with empty fuel tanks and no spare engines, a monument to wasted potential, and a reminder that technology alone has never been enough to win wars. The Allies didn't need a jet bomber to flatten Germany. They did it with thousands of conventional bombers, overwhelming numbers, industrial might, and the determination to see the job through to the end. Hitler had dismissed the idea of prioritizing jet fighters over jet bombers as useless. He was wrong. But by the time that became clear, it no longer mattered. Germany was already defeated, and the world's first jet bomber was just one more advanced weapon that arrived too late to change anything at all.